Ja, vielen.
Thank you very much for being here. And also, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Do you know what day it is today? Funny enough, today is the German Diversity Day, or how marginalized people call it, Tuesday. What I want to say by that is that diversity is something we should think not just on the days that we celebrate it together. I already listened to, gave 2 talks today at a bank because people suddenly realize, oh, it's German Diversity Day. But actually, for 365 days for marginalized people, it is Diversity Day. The absurd thing is all these diversity days, and I realize this every year again and again, is that people with disabilities are always named last and forgotten first. Of course, there's also different forms of marginalization, marginalized groups that are being forgotten about, stateless people, people that are affected by classism or racism, but it is always very noticeable how we deal with the topic of inclusion, and we talk about disabled people on diversity days, and it's mostly non-disabled people talking. So I think it's great that Republika is aware of this issue and also trying their best to do things better. Of course, the question, who cares? The motto of today's and last few days' event is not just about people with disabilities, but today I want to put the focus on people with disabilities specifically. So first, the question is posed every day. Who cares? For people with disabilities often means who cares about us, who takes care and who doesn't, and who doesn't care. So in a societal context, there's a lot of inverse questions there, and the reflex to quickly forget and banish people with disabilities from societal life. That doesn't start with conferences or diversity days, but it begins very early, and it starts already in childhood, or rather the unlived childhood. Even before a child with disabilities is born, since 2022, the public health insurance, for example, will cover costs for prenatal diagnostics. So, for example, Down syndrome or other disabilities can be screened for, and in 9 out of 10 cases, children with these disabilities will be aborted. So we ask the question too often, can we imagine life with a disabled child, and answer it with no. But we don't ask the question, why do we respond with no? It's often not the disability itself, but the stigmatization that parents or disabled people experience every day. And once they exist, they are consistently being put into parallel systems, into special needs education, special needs housing. These are parallel structures where they are isolated from the majority society and often also exploited. For example, in the workshops where they earn less than the minimum wage. Wherever it says that disabled people are especially protected or cared for, they also often experience violence. As we showed at our project ableismus.de, Ableism Kills, together with lots of other people with disabilities, where we document and show how quickly people with disabilities are being put into danger, and also especially women with disabilities experience violence 4 times more often than non-disabled women. And people always argue we should keep people with disabilities in these kinds of establishments because they're better protected there. But who do we actually protect? At the end of the day, I have to realize that we protect the majority society instead from having to engage with the topic of diversity and inclusion. And still, transportation, mobility, and even some doors are not accessible. So people with disabilities cannot actually move in the public sphere with the same rights as non-disabled people. relatives take over unpaid care work because they cannot find enough functional and dignified solutions. And even paid care work is exploitation. For a 30-hour week, people are often being paid less than a mini job, so less than minimum wage. And even though well-paid care work might be possible, the people affected aren't actually being informed about it. So including people with disabilities in the way that people with disabilities experience everyday life, that's called ableism. And it systematically denies people with disabilities their right to exist. So you could ask the question, who cares about ableism? And it seems kind of self-evident that disabled people as well have a right to be seen and included. It's even codified in the United Nations Convention on Disability Rights that Germany has ratified in 2010. That says people with disabilities have to have full access to physical, social, political, and economical environment, to health, education, information, and communication, so they can experience all liberties and basic human rights in full. And this UN Convention on Disability Rights does not create any special rights, but instead it names the universal human rights for the first time concretely from the perspective of people with disabilities. And it references the Universal Declaration of Universal Human Rights by the United Nations, and by far too little of that is actually being put into practice today. So who cares? To put it simply, inclusion is not charity. After more than 20 years of activism, I am a little bit sobered by the thought that we need to create, we need to tear down barriers instead of constantly philosophizing about them. And of course, it also requires political will and legislative action, but just continuously monitoring the non-enactment of legal frameworks has no consequences if there's no sanctions. I've come to believe that it's due to the always same questions that the inclusion of disabled people is always being met with. I have also reproduced the same slogans over and over. We have to lower the barriers in the heads before we can get to actionable changes. And it keeps being suggested that we somehow have to take people along on the way, and they just haven't reached that point yet. We have to first talk to all the skeptics before we can actually enact any real change. And I think it feels unfair also towards you as non-disabled listeners, maybe. I don't assume that all non-disabled people have some sort of barrier in their heads that needs to be lowered first. I think it's much worse to hear slogans like, and that's usually said by non-disabled people, slogans like, I'm not trained for people with disabilities, and that's why I don't do anything. And one term that we hear there again and again is curative educational nursing or care. I just want to kind of analyze this word. As a disabled person, I don't want to be healed or cured or educated or nursed. I demand a self-determined life, that I can live in dignity just like all other people without disabilities. And not just me, but this is a right that all humans have, including all humans with disabilities. The curative or healing contains the word healing, contains the stem heal, and education is education, of course, but there's only two groups of people that we can educate by first. That's children and people in prisons. But I'm neither a child nor am I a prisoner. And not every person with disabilities wants to be nursed or taken care of, but they need assistance. And care work often contains a sort of power imbalance that the caretaker has to be good for the person being cared for. So when people say, "Oh, I'm not trained for this," professional caretakers should take care of that. That's the opposite of inclusion, because that means that behind every disabled person in the future, there should only be one professional, one trained professional. That would mean that teachers can just rest and say, "Oh, this is for special ed teachers." And that, my friends, is the opposite of inclusion. That is exclusion.
As I said, our diagnoses are nobody's business. But to say you first need a training before you can interact with a person with disability, that is just wrong. It's a wrong approach. Because if we're honest, the parents of children with disabilities didn't have training before either. And people with disabilities, neither. That's how we tap into the topic of the school system. In Germany, we have the absurd situation that children with disabilities are systematically sorted out by the school system, while inclusion is actually growing in the regular schools. How can that be? Does that mean there's more and more people with disabilities? On paper, yes, but diagnoses are getting more and more refined. What used to be just a very silent or a very lively child in the old days, now they have attention deficit disorder or something else. I invite you, especially the ones into doing research, check how big the proportion of people who with a migrational background in special needs schools, how often are they diagnosed with a learning disability? Would we also say that about a child who speaks Swedish? Then the situation that nobody's fighting for good education, if then those are the parents whose children are already in school at the moment, everybody's fighting for their own children. I like to quote Tanja Häusler, a co-founder, who once said, "We need a strong lobby for good schools, a school for everyone." No one does that. We're all happy that we don't have to go to school anymore until we have children. And then we're happy when the children are out again. What does that mean? What does that do to our society when we don't celebrate education as something that's important? We are waiting permanently for forever. We constantly are worried about the well-being of our children in school, and we think that children with disability are at fault when inclusion is not working, and that children are learning more slowly when a child with disabilities are in class. But as I said, if we're interested in good education, the question needs to be allowed: how are children doing in special needs schools? I'm fed up with what happened again yesterday at the Dreisat Kulturzeit, that an example of inclusion that works and an example of inclusion that doesn't work are played against each other. And then we say, it depends on the child, and we have to ask the question why the child with a disability is better off in the special needs school, what happened in the regular school. Why don't you, as a journeyman, ask that question? Why do I have to do that for you? A few years ago at Republica, I said, this suffering just serves to being a cleaning lady. Journalists, please do your job. Ask the question, is it really about calling learning in special needs school, inclusion in special needs school, as success or a failure? Ask or give the option that it might fail. It's not the question if, it's a question of how. The solution is actually quite clear. The solution is a school for everyone. And after the UN Convention for the Rights of Disabled People, we have to get rid of special needs schools. And that means that wasn't the painful sentence, but that also means we need to get rid of high school as well, or Gymnasium, which is a special German school, because the high school is a special needs school for the elites. On the labor market, people with disabilities experience a lot. There's constant prejudices that people with disabilities supposedly aren't performing as well. They're too expensive, too much of a fuss, and that means companies are paying for not taking them. And then they say that the skills for people with disabilities weren't enough. But then why aren't we training them? Doesn't that also start in schools? Is the problem that people with disabilities can't take the pressure? Is that really the problem? My colleague Anne Gerstorff and Carina Stomm, my colleagues, described this really well by saying, stop the ableism. They say even people with disabilities have a right to failure. Or to put this better, self-determination also includes making mistakes and learning from them. When I was studying, I was told that I couldn't do a semester abroad because no insurance would ever take care for that. And I believed it. But now I know that was wrong. How often do we leave people with disabilities behind while saying it's too dangerous, something could go wrong? There are 300,000 people with disabilities working in workshops for people with disabilities, and on average they earn €1.50 per hour, which is less than minimum wage. Who cares? On the next Christmas market, you might be buying an object that has been produced in one of those workshops and you have a good feeling, but be honest. People with disabilities who work in those workshops are the only group in Germany who are allowed to earn less than minimum wage. Even prisoners in workshops have achieved a success by law that they have to earn more, but it doesn't seem to apply to people with disabilities. But that would be its own talk. That's a different discussion. As a society, we have to ask the question, why can we just get rid of people with disability with the argument of costs, always saying no insurance would ever pay for that, it's too expensive. And there are other groups that are just fobbed off with this argument, like people who are seeking asylum with this argument for costs, or social securities, or protecting the climate. So people with disabilities, children, and people and migrants are the only groups that can be fobbed off with the argument of costs. And that is a problem. Are people with disabilities only relevant when they don't cost anything, when they're inspiring, or at least aren't annoying? At least those parallel structures are also expensive. Very often the failure is the structures of decision-making and the deciders. And that raises the question, who cares? Who really cares? In leadership positions, there are very few people with disabilities. Look at it. During the diversity days, who talks about disabilities? Very often, those are people from institutions, but not people who are affected themselves. We also talk about people without disabilities as plobs, people living off disables, people who profit off the topic but are not affected themselves. What would a world look like if people with disabilities would shape the world that's for them? What could we do with the billions in this system if people with disabilities would decide what the money is used for? How we would set the priorities quite differently, definitely. So what can we do? Talking about allyship. Sometimes I think that people without disabilities think that people with disabilities would take something away from them when they claim their rights for access, but there is no accessibility that was ever detrimental to people without disabilities. So what good are all these appeals in seminars, workshops, and so on if nothing ever changes? Who is acting for change is often hitting the problem that people feel limited and stop listening. And that's very dangerous. What we can do is find common topic and address them towards those who are actually in charge. So how do we get leadership to listen to us and to contribute to the solution? By becoming many. I was often asked, Krauthausen, how we have to do a demonstration again at the Brandenburger Tor. We get all the people with disabilities together all throughout Germany, like Fridays for Future. That's a great idea. But how is this supposed to work with 2 places for people with disabilities in every ICE? How many months would we need to get everyone here? Even that is a problem. By being loud, is that the answer? Do we have to be loud? Do we have to block the streets using tractors? Are we heard then? By showing that solutions might be also in the interest of people who aren't affected, do we always have to allow ourselves? Are we sometimes addressing the wrong positions? You cannot enforce a culture of diversity by law. You can't just say you all have to be nice to each other. You can't decree it. What we need is a new culture. The Culture Hack Lab has a great approach for that. It is an organization that's specialized to get cultural interventions for the changes of the system. They analyze narratives and what purpose those serve and formulate those narratives anew. Because there, where we're telling a new story, we're thinking about things in different ways. From the narrative of people with disability who need help, we can change the narrative towards a person who is self-determined. And they're part of society like everyone else. People with disabilities, we should ask them about different topics and not just ask them to talk about diversity and inclusion. Or, as the movement says, nothing about us without us. Or, as I would say, nothing without us, as I prefer it.
One example of what that could look like, I will show you now.
That I cannot drink a margarita. So you don't serve me a margarita? So I don't drink a margarita. Your assumption becomes reality. And parents, you assume that I cannot live on my own. So you don't encourage me to live on my own. So I don't live on my own. Coach, you assume that I cannot hit harder. So you don't train me to hit harder. So I don't hit harder. And teacher, you assume that I cannot learn Shakespeare. So you don't teach me Shakespeare.
Old MacDonald had a farm.
So I don't learn Shakespeare. E-I-E-I-O. But hey, if all your assumptions become reality, then assume that I can drink a margarita. So you serve me a margarita. So I drink a margarita. Assume that I can live on my own. So I live on my own. Assume that I can hit harder. So I hit harder. Assume that I can learn Shakespeare. So, what fools these mortals be? I learned fucking Shakespeare. You assume I can swear, right? Assume that I can do that job. That I can go to parties. That I can have sex. That I can be on stage. Assume that I can. So maybe I will.
If we always assume that disabled people cannot do something, then they won't do it. If we assume that theoretically anything is possible, then people can learn their boundaries and maybe go beyond their limits where possible, or accept them where not. That we keep seeing disabilities as a deficit is part of the problem. The author Aled Mansky, in his book The Power of Disability, says there's also sources of energy that disabled people have within them, such as the power of the power of creativity, the power of ideas. There's no other group that encounters barriers in their everyday life like disabled people. So they constantly have to think about solutions, how they can still get there despite all the barriers in their life. And this source of power is something we can leverage in our day-to-day. We can look at their experiences and their expertise. We can also assume that any innovation that we use, almost every innovation we use in our everyday life, will also benefit people with disabilities. I'm reading from an ebook reader that was originally developed for people with disabilities. The AirPods or earpods that you have in your ears are nothing but hearing aids. The e-scooters that you took to get here are nothing but electrified wheelchairs. And these are all things that have been developed for or with people with disabilities. And there's also the power of creativity. We often hear sentences like, "Oh, I couldn't do it if I was you. I respect how you do it, how you get through your day." So I used to think, "Oh, so you would have killed yourself if you were me?" And then at some point I realized they don't actually mean it like that, even though the words are still super annoying, but they actually mean something different. That deep within them, they often carry something that they are afraid of, something they have never told anyone about, where they feel like they're not good enough. And just existing as a person with disabilities and showing it, and showing how you deal with your shortcomings, is really inspiring to them. So if I stand on my head, I'm just going to be an upside-down wheelchair user. I cannot pretend I'm not disabled. People that feel they have some shortcoming within, they try to hide it and get away with it in society. Queer people, trans people always have to repress a part of themselves, and that is labeled as a shortcoming by society. Same for people with chronic disease or disabilities. And at some point when it breaks through, they have to go through therapy, because otherwise they will not be able to deal with it. And we don't have that option. We just have to go out with it and deal with it as good as we can. And that power, that is what people are jealous of when they say, "Oh, I couldn't do this in your place." I don't expect like applause or praise for that, and I still don't like this sentence, but you often underestimate how much effort people have to expend in a day-to-day life to even be here, and that is something that is not appreciated, and that is also one of the powers of disability. Disabled people influence our culture more than we believe in our everyday life, and that is something that we can support better by not begging for accessibility, but by making it mandatory, by turning it upside down. Instead of informing people what is accessible and inclusive, but instead requiring people to justify why something is not accessible, why it hasn't been thought that way. And you can all start with ourselves and our environment. When we assume that people with disabilities belong and always think accessibility in everything we do, start casting and watching movies and plays with disabled actors in movies and theater, that disabled people also belong on stage, that they have to be cast and trained. Let's send our non-disabled children into special education schools and demand inclusion of our non-disabled children, because your children also have a right to grow up with diversity. Buy diverse literature for your children. For example, Are You Disabled or What? By Mareike Kaiser and Rebecca Maskos, or When Ella Conquered Space by myself and Anna Biermann. And maybe ask yourselves why none of your colleagues have a disability. Because non-disabled people also have a right and the responsibility to live together with disabled people. we care for each other. That's the motto we have to live. Do we support? Let's support a disability movement. Show each other how we can defend ourselves. Seek for people with disabilities when you need a photographer or anything, and pay them. Let's raise our voices wherever people with disabilities are not included, not invited, and let's make political inclusion without alternative. So, because there's more than white, non-disabled, heterosexual men, there is the majority, if we think about intersectionality. And I want to close with this. Journalists are constantly asking us what we wish for in terms of inclusion or accessibility in the coming years. And my answer has become, I stopped wishing, I'm now demanding only. This is not a children's birthday party. So let's prepare for a long battle. Let's prepare for inclusion being a tough battle. It's not a unicorn land, and you are allowed to say Raul gave a shitty talk, and that's your right. But you cannot say that's why disabled people shouldn't be on stage. Inclusion is not about cherry picking. It's visiting a park where you can not choose who else is in the park with you. It's not a checklist that you complete at some point and then you can go back to nicer things, but it's a permanent assumption and acceptance of diverse people. Inclusion, to make it short, always asks the question of power. So we care. Thank you.